If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. The Roman outpost stood isolated on the frontier, a rectangle of stone walls built to endure wind, raids, and long months of silence. Its garrison numbered barely 100 men, posted far from Rome's center of power, tasked with guarding a valley that yielded little but dust, rock, and a stubborn local population. Marcus, a legionary of 10 years' service, entered through the north gate after a patrol. His armor pressed heavy on his shoulders, sweat stung his eyes, and his legs ached from the uneven ground. He had joined the army in 19, fleeing debts and the disappointment of a father who saw him as unfit to manage land. 10 years had left him with scars, calloused hands, and little else. His service had carried him across provinces, always to places where resentment against Rome burned beneath the surface. He thought less of glory now and more of survival. One more day, one more posting, one more campaign. At the center of the camp, a group of women brought in from nearby villages worked under watch. Some carried water, others prepared meals. They had been taken years earlier, not as slaves, but as forced laborers under Rome's authority, an arrangement that stripped them of choice but left them alive and within the outpost walls. Among them was Lucia. She had once been the daughter of a farmer, her family's land seized after her father resisted Roman taxation. When the soldiers came, she was spared only because the centurion valued her ability to cook, mend, and keep order among the other women. She had lived inside the camp for 3 years, quiet, withdrawn, never raising her voice, never offering more than necessary. As Marcus approached the fire pit, weary and slow, some of the younger women, perhaps trying to break their own boredom, made a show of lifting him off his feet. They laughed as they carried him a few steps, mocking his fatigue. A soldier of Rome paraded like a child. Marcus forced a crooked smile, playing along with the noise, but inside, heat rose in his chest. It was not anger at the women. He knew their mockery was a thin disguise for their own resentment and powerlessness. It was shame, the realization that even in jest, he was no more than a burden, too tired to carry himself with dignity. As they lowered him, Marcus glanced toward Lucia. She had not joined the laughter. She stood over the cooking pot, cutting dried roots into a broth, her hands steady, her face without expression. Yet in her eyes, when she looked up briefly, he saw something sharper than silence. Exhaustion, carved deep and unshakable. She looked at him not with fear, not with admiration, but with a heaviness he recognized. Years taken, choices erased, life narrowed to routine. That single glance unsettled Marcus more than the laughter. He adjusted the strap of his armor, cleared his throat, and sat on a stone bench, trying to dismiss the unease. But as the smell of boiling roots spread across the yard and the women's voices drifted into the air, he kept thinking of that look. It told him more than words could. She was not impressed by Rome's authority or his uniform. She was simply enduring as he was. Marcus felt the familiar press of questions he tried to bury. Why had he stayed in the army this long? Why did he continue serving when his years had already been taken? As his hands rested on his knees, he wondered, for the first time in months, if someone inside this camp understood what it was to live without choice. Lucia, for her part, kept her focus on the pot, but she felt the soldier's eyes linger on her. She did not trust him, nor any man in uniform. Yet she sensed something different in his silence. He had not laughed loudly with the others. He had not mocked her labor. She tightened her grip on the knife, finishing her task, reminding herself that survival meant distance. Still, she noticed his unease, and for reasons she could not name, she did not look away immediately. In that harsh, ordinary evening of the Roman frontier, nothing more passed between them. No words, no gestures. But for both Marcus and Lucia, the moment lingered longer than the laughter had. The next morning began with the same routine. The clang of the morning horn, soldiers forming lines for inspection, women moving quietly toward their duties. Yet the mood within the camp was heavier than the clear sky above it. Marcus took his post by the north wall, Scanning the valley, the little stirred beyond a few scattered goats grazing on the scrub. His body moved with the practiced rhythm of duty, but his mind kept circling back to the night before. The laughter, the brief weight of shame, and above all, the look from Lucia that unsettled him more than anything. For the soldiers, life at the outpost was not glory, but waiting. They were stationed here because Rome needed a presence, a reminder to the province that resistance carried consequences. Supply caravans came rarely, and news from Rome even less. The men drank when they could, quarreled when bored, and clung to routine to keep from dwelling on the emptiness of their assignment. Marcus knew that questions lingered among them. Why defend a place so poor in resources? Why keep watch over a valley that gave little in return? But orders were orders, and to disobey meant lashes or worse. For the women, life was different, but equally narrow. They cooked, repaired, carried, and mended. Though not chained, they had no freedom to leave the camp. Some had children with them. Others had lost their families long before. Questions often weighed on their minds, too. Would they ever return to their homes? Would the soldiers ever tire of this place and abandon it? These questions were never asked aloud. Survival depended on silence. It was during the evening meal that Marcus found himself close to Lucia again. She ladled thin broth into clay bowls, passing them one by one to the soldiers waiting in line. When his turn came, she did not look at him directly, but her hand paused for half a breath as she handed him the bowl. It was a small thing, easy to miss, but Marcus felt it. He wanted to say something, even something as simple as thanks, but the weight of silence pressed against his throat. He returned to his bench, staring at the rising steam. The questions the listeners might have asked after the first chapter now unfolded clearly in the rhythm of daily life. Who was Lucia beyond the fire pit? She was the daughter of a farmer, her family broken when Rome seized their land. Her quiet was not weakness but a shield, protecting her from soldiers' curiosity. Why did Marcus react so strongly to her gaze? Because it mirrored his own exhaustion. He too lived without choices, bound not by chains but by the oath of service that had taken more than a decade of his life. Why were these two people here, circling each other in silence? Because the frontier forced them together. She had no land to return to. He had no home beyond the standards of Rome. As the evening darkened, Marcus lingered near the fire longer than usual. He watched her distribute the last of the bread, noticed how she divided it carefully so each received something, even when supplies were low. That fairness struck him. It was not duty. It was choice, the choice of someone who still tried to keep balance in a place where so much had been taken. Later, when the camp settled into uneasy rest, Marcus lay awake on his cot. He listened to the shuffle of guards at the gate, the occasional cough of a soldier in sleep, and thought of her steady hands, her silent patience. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, supplies, unrest, or another storm. But he knew he had begun to look at one woman in the camp differently, and he realized that in her silence, he had found the first voice worth listening to in years. The first signs of trouble came with the empty wagons. When the supply train finally reached the outpost after weeks of delay, the soldiers gathered eagerly, expecting sacks of grain, dried meat, oil, and wine. Instead, the carts held little more than spoiled grain and a few amphorae of watered wine. The drivers muttered that raids and storms had ruined the journey, and they could carry no more. The centurion cursed them, but shouting did not fill the stores. The men looked at one another with unease, knowing what hunger meant in a place already starved of comfort. The women were ordered to stretch the food as far as possible. They boiled thin broth, baking bread, so small it was gone in 2 bites. Marcus, standing in line one evening, noticed how Lucia handled the meager rations. She split them evenly, watching carefully so no soldier received more than another, even when some tried to demand larger portions. The men grumbled, yet none dared push her too far. Her fairness gave her a quiet authority that no soldier wanted to challenge openly. Marcus thought of the listener's unspoken question from before. How could a woman, stripped of choice, still hold a kind of control? The answer was in her steady hands and unflinching eyes. The cold arrived soon after. Winds cut through the valley, and the stone walls of the outpost trapped the chill inside. Fires burned low to conserve fuel, and men wrapped themselves in cloaks too thin to keep out the frost. Marcus lay awake on his cot, teeth clenched against the cold, listening to the restless shifting of others who also could not sleep. In the dim light of dawn, he saw Lucia tending the fire earlier than usual, shoulders drawn tight under her worn shawl. She carried water with red hands, her breath sharp in the air. It was then that Marcus made his first real choice. He walked to her side without speaking and set down half of his ration of bread beside her pot. She glanced at it, then at him, her face unreadable, but she did not refuse. Instead, she moved the bread closer to the fire, warming it before placing it in the pot where others' portions were being prepared. She gave no thanks, but the act itself was her reply. She had accepted it not as a gift to her alone, but as something to be shared. That night, when the wind howled through the cracks of the barracks, Marcus left his post by the gate and draped his spare cloak on the bench near the fire where Lucia sat cooking. He did not hand it to her directly. He only left it within her reach. She stared at it for a long moment, then pulled it around her shoulders. For the first time, her expression softened, though only slightly. Questions the listeners might have carried from earlier now found answers in these moments. Why did Marcus linger near her? Because in her silence he saw his own reflection. Years of service that had stripped him of pride, but left him searching for something steady. Why did she accept his small offerings after keeping her distance so long? Because she recognized, perhaps against her own will, that his gestures were not a soldier's orders, but a man's quiet attempt to bridge the distance. The camp survived those weeks on thin meals and thin fire. Yet for Marcus and Lucia, survival meant more than enduring cold and hunger. It meant discovering that presence. Two people choosing, wordlessly, to remain near could hold as much strength as any promise spoken aloud. And as Marcus returned to his cot that night, he realized he no longer thought of her as just another face at the fire. He thought of her as someone whose silence mattered, someone whose nearness had begun to change the shape of his own days. The storm struck without warning. By late afternoon, the horizon had darkened, and heavy winds swept across the valley, carrying dust and broken branches against the walls of the outpost. The soldiers muttered about the god's anger, but their centurion barked orders to secure the gates and tie down the tents that housed the supplies. When the first sheets of rain poured down, men scrambled across the yard, shouting over the roar of the wind. Roof tiles cracked, ropes snapped, and the thin fires used for cooking hissed and died. Marcus rushed from the barracks with two other soldiers, sent to fasten the canvas that covered the food stores. But when he reached the yard, he saw Lucia already there, gripping a rope with both hands as the storm tried to tear it away. Her shawl whipped in the wind, rain soaking her hair until it clung to her face. The other women had fled inside, yet she remained, fighting to keep the food from being lost. Marcus hesitated for a breath, surprised by her determination, before throwing himself beside her. Together they pulled the rope tight, bracing their bodies against the gusts. The storm battered them for what felt like hours. Marcus's arms ached, his palms burned, and his thoughts turned grim. If the stores were destroyed, hunger would return sharper than before. He thought of the men who would blame the women, and of Lucia, who would bear the harshest words for something she had tried to prevent. His jaw tightened. He could not allow that to happen. With every surge of wind, he shifted his weight, using his strength to anchor the canvas. When the storm finally broke and the rain slowed to a steady drizzle, the store still stood, the food safe beneath the soaked canvas. Exhausted, Marcus lowered the rope and wiped water from his eyes. He glanced at Lucia. She stood shivering, her lips pale, but she did not complain or step back until the task was finished. Only then did she move toward the fire pit, her body trembling from cold. For a moment Marcus followed silently, unsure whether he should speak. When she sat down, he placed a bowl in her hands, filling it with what broth remained from the evening meal. She stared at it, then at him, and for the first time her voice broke the silence. "Eat," she said softly. One word, nothing more. The sound startled him. Her voice was steady despite her shaking hands. It carried no fear, no bitterness, only a quiet insistence. Marcus took the bowl and drank, his chest tightening at the simple command. No soldier had ever spoken to him in a way that felt less like duty and more like care. For listeners, questions from earlier found answers in this storm. Why had Lucia risked herself in the open when the others had retreated? Because she knew that without the food, survival was impossible, and endurance meant more than her own safety. Why had Marcus thrown himself into the task when he could have left it to others? Because he could not watch her carry the weight alone. Not after seeing how she had stretched every ration and faced every hardship with the same resolve he longed to share. That night, when the barracks settled into uneasy quiet, Marcus lay awake, the memory of her single word still echoing in his mind. It was not a grand gesture, not a vow or promise, but it was enough to make him believe that something had shifted between them. The silence they had shared was no longer only necessity. It was becoming a language of its own. The days after the storm carried a different air. The outpost still looked the same. Stone walls, mud, the restless shuffle of soldiers. But inside its walls something had shifted. Marcus and Lucia moved through their tasks as before, but there was a quiet recognition between them now, the memory of shared struggle etched into their movements. When he passed her at the fire, she did not turn away as quickly. When she handed him bread, her fingers lingered a breath longer. The soldiers noticed, though they said little at first. A few smirked, whispering jokes under their breath, but even they did not push too far. They had seen Marcus stand beside her in the storm, had seen him soaked and shivering with the same desperation as any man fighting for his life. They had also seen Lucia hold her ground, refusing to yield when others would have fled. In the harsh reality of the frontier, respect often came in silence, and few dared challenge the bond forming between them. At night, around the fire, Marcus sometimes carved small shapes from scraps of wood, soldiers' idle work to keep their hands busy. He was not skilled, but he made simple figures, a horse, a bird, a rough outline of a tree. One evening, he placed one of these figures, a small horse, on the table beside the bread. He said nothing, only left it there. Lucia looked at it for a long time, her expression unreadable. Then she picked it up and set it carefully inside her pouch. The faintest smile touched her lips, and though it faded quickly, Marcus caught it. For the listeners, some questions lingered after earlier chapters. Did others in the camp object to their closeness? The answer was no, not openly. In a place where survival outweighed pride, most soldiers understood the value of quiet companionship. Did Lucia truly trust Marcus, or was she only tolerating him? The truth showed in her actions. She accepted his bread, his cloak, and now his carving. Not as favors forced upon her, but as gestures freely given, and in return, she allowed herself to acknowledge them. Did Marcus seek more than silence and routine? The answer was yes, though he did not speak it aloud. His decision to remain near her, to share what little he had, was a choice born of need, not just for survival, but for belonging. One evening, when the fire burned low and the others drifted to their cots, Marcus lingered near the cooking pit. He cleared his throat, uncertain if words would break what they had built. Finally, he said, "You kept us alive that night." His voice was low, rough from disuse. Lucia looked at him, her face calm. "We both did," she replied simply. Her answer left him still, the weight of it settling deep. It was the first time she had spoken more than a single word to him. It told him what he had begun to believe. She did not see him as her master or captor, but as a man who had stood beside her when it mattered. From then on, the silence between them was no longer emptiness. It was a space filled with choice, each gesture shaping something stronger than routine. For Marcus, the barracks no longer felt like a prison of service. For Lucia, the fire pit no longer felt like a cage of duty. Both had begun, quietly and without declaration, to build something that neither Rome nor the storms of the frontier could strip away. Spring brought changes to the valley. The air softened, The frozen ground loosened, and small patches of green broke through the dirt around the outpost. With the season came new orders from the provincial governor. The garrison would remain at the frontier permanently. No transfers, no rotation back to larger towns. For most soldiers, this news felt like a weight. They had dreamed of returning closer to the heart of Rome, of better rations, warmer quarters, and familiar streets. Now, they understood they were bound to this place indefinitely. Marcus, however, felt no despair. For the first time in years, the thought of permanence did not bring dread. His eyes sought Lucia as the orders were read, and in that moment he realized that staying here no longer meant only service to Rome. It meant staying near her. The questions that might have lingered for listeners: would he ever escape his oath? Would she ever be released from the camp? No longer mattered in the same way. The frontier, once a prison, had become the ground where their lives crossed. Daily life steadied into a rhythm, but it was no longer routine, stripped of meaning. When Marcus stood guard, Lucia carried water past him, and their eyes met in quiet recognition. When she needed bread, he left small pieces of wood near her station, each one carved with more care than the last. She kept them all, not hidden, but arranged in her pouch as if they were treasures. In the evenings, when the fire glowed and the camp quieted, they sat nearer than before, their silence no longer guarded but comfortable, like the presence of someone who belonged. It was not without risk. The centurion, though pragmatic, still demanded discipline, and Marcus knew that if their closeness threatened order, punishment could follow. Yet nothing was spoken against them. The other soldiers had seen too many winters to mock what they understood themselves. That companionship was the only shield against loneliness. And for the women, seeing Lucia's bond with Marcus offered its own measure of hope, that even within Rome's walls, not everything was stripped away. One morning, as the sun rose clear over the valley, Marcus stood by the gate while Lucia approached with a jug of water. He reached out, not for the jug but for her hand. She stopped, glancing around, then allowed his fingers to close around hers. The gesture was small, but it was a decision, a declaration made not in words but in plain sight. Neither of them spoke, yet the moment left no doubt. They were no longer simply surviving beside each other. They had chosen to remain together. For listeners, the final unanswered questions from the beginning now found closure. Did Marcus ever find freedom from the life that bound him? Yes, not through release from service, but through building a life worth staying in. Did Lucia ever escape the shadow of being a captive laborer? Yes, not by leaving the camp, but by reclaiming dignity and belonging with a man who saw her as equal. Were they bound by duty alone, or by something stronger? The truth showed itself in every shared gesture. They had made family from what remained. That evening, when the camp settled, Marcus carved one last figure. A simple house, its roof and walls shaped from the rough grain of frontier wood. He placed it in Lucia's hands without explanation. She studied it, then looked up at him, her eyes steady. For the first time, she smiled openly, the expression warming her face in a way he had never seen before. In that smile, there was no bitterness, no fear, no exhaustion, only recognition. The Roman frontier remained harsh, but Marcus and Lucia no longer faced it alone. Their story did not end in farewell or loss. It ended in the quiet certainty of two people who had endured and chosen to stay, not because Rome demanded it, but because they had found one another.